Chapter 1, Structural Change. Understanding the present usually involves some grasp of its past. This holds true as much for an individual or social group as for an entire country such as India. India has a long and rich history, while knowing about its past in ancient and medieval times is important. Its colonial experience is particularly significant for comprehending modern India. This is not just because many modern ideas and institutions reached India through colonialism, it is also because such an exposure to modern ideas was contradictory or paradoxical. For example, Indians in the colonial period read about Western liberalism and freedom, yet they lived under a Western colonial rule that denied Indians liberty and freedom. It is contradiction of this kind that shaped many of the structural and cultural changes that chapter 1 and 2 looks at. As the few next chapters shall show, our social reform, nationalist movement, our laws, our political life, and our constitution, our industry and agriculture, our cities and our villages have been shaped by our paradoxical experience with colonialism. This has had lasting implications for our specific experience with modernity. The following are just some of the many instances we face in our daily life. We have a parliamentary and a legal system, a police and educational system built very much on the British model. We drive on the left side of the road like the British. We have bread omelette and cutlets as menu offered in many roadside eateries and canteens. A very popular manufacturer of biscuits is actually named after Britain. Many school uniforms include neckties. We often admire the vest and as often resent it. These are just of the some of the many and complex ways that British colonialism lives on in contemporary India. Let us take the example of English language and show how its impact has been many sided and paradoxical in nature. In India, this is not a matter about wrong spellings alone. English is not only widely used in India, but we now have an impressive body of literary writings by Indians in English. This knowledge of English has been given in Indians an edge in the global market. But English continues to be a mark of privilege. Not knowing English is a disadvantage that tells in the job market. At the same time, for those who were traditionally deprived to access to formal education such as the Dalits, knowledge of English may open doors of opportunities that were formerly closed. In this chapter, we focus on structural changes that colonialism brought in. We, therefore, need to shift from this broad impressionistic view to a clearer understanding of colonialism as a structure and system. Colonialism brought into being political, new economic, and social structural changes. In this chapter, we look at only two of these structural changes, namely industrialization and urbanization. While the focus is on a specific colonial context, we also briefly touch on development after independence. Also, these structural changes were accompanied by cultural changes, which we look at in the next chapter. However, any strict separation of the two is difficult. As you will see, the structural changes are difficult to discuss without the mention of the cultural changes too. Understanding colonialism. At one level, colonialism simply means the establishment of rule by one country over another. In the modern period, Western colonialism has had the greatest impact. India's past has been marked by the entry of numerous groups of people at different times who have established their rule over different parts of what constitutes modern India today. The impact of colonial rule is distinguishable from all other earlier rules because the changes it brought in were far reaching and deep. History is full of examples of the annexation of foreign territory and the domination of weaker by strong powers. Nevertheless, there is a vital difference between the empire building of pre capitalist times and that of capitalist times. Apart from outright pillage, The pre capitalist conquerors benefited from their domination by exacting a continuous law of tribute. On the whole, they did not interfere with the economic base, they simply took the tribute that was skimmed off the economic surplus that was produced additionally in the subjugated areas. In contrast, British colonialism, which was based on a capitalist system, directly interfered to ensure greatest profit and benefit to British capitalism. Every policy was geared towards the strengthening and expansion of British capitalism. For instance, it changed the very laws of the land. It changed not just the land ownership laws, but decided even what crops ought to be grown and what ought not to be. It meddled with the manufacturing sector. It altered the way production and distribution of goods takes place. It entered into the forest, it cleared trees and started tea plantations. It brought in forest acts that changed the lives of the pastoralists. They were prevented from entering many forests that had earlier provided valuable forage for their cattle. The box carries a brief account of impact of colonial forest policy in northeast India. Colonialism has also led to considerable movement of people. It led to movement of people from one part of India to another within India. For instance, people from present-day Jharkhand moved to Assam to work on the tea plantations. A newly emerging middle class, particularly from the British Presidency regions of Bengal and Madras, moved as government employees, and professionals like doctors and lawyers moved to different parts of the country. People were carted in ships from India to work on other colonialized lands in Eastern Asia, Africa, and America. Many died on their way, most could not ever return. Today, many of their descendants are known as people of Indian origin. To facilitate the smooth functioning of its rule, colonialism introduced a wide variety of array of changes in every sphere, be it legal or cultural or architectural. Colonialism was a story apart in the very scale and the intensity of the changes that it brought about. Some of the changes were deliberate, while some took place in an unintended fashion. For example, we saw how Western education was introduced to create Indians who would manage British colonialism. Instead, it led to the growth of a nationalist and anti colonial consciousness. This magnitude and depth of the structural changes that colonialism unleashed can be better grasped if we try and understand some basic features of capitalism. Capitalism is an economic system in which the means of production are privately owned and organized to accumulate profit within a market system. Capitalism in the West emerged out of a complex process of European exploration of the rest of the world. Its plunder of wealth and resources, and unprecedented growth of science and technology, its harnessing to industries and agriculture. What marked capitalism from the very beginning was its dynamism. Its potential to grow, expand, innovate, use technology and labor in a way best assured to ensure greatest profit. What marked it too was its global nature. Western colonialism was inextricably connected to the growth of Western capitalism. This had a lasting impact on the way capitalism developed in a colonialized country like India. In the next section on industrialization and urbanization, we see how colonialism led to the very distinct patterns. If capitalism became the dominant economic system, nation states become the dominant political form. Yet we all live in nation states and we all have a nationality or a national citizenship may appear natural to us today. Before the First World War, passports were not widely used for international travel, and in most areas, few people had one. Societies were, however, not always organized on these lines. Nation state pertains to a particular type of state. Characteristics of the modern world: a government has sovereign power with a defined territorial area and people of citizens of a single nation. Nation states are closely associated with the rise of nationalism. The principle of nationalism assumes that Any set of people have a right to be free and exercise sovereign power. It is an important part of the rise of democratic ideas. We will be reading more about this in chapter 3. It must have struck you that practice of colonialism and the principle of nationalism and democratic rights are contradictory. For colonial rule implied foreign rule such as British rule over India, nationalism implied that the people of India or of any colonized society have an equal right to be sovereign. Indian nationalist leaders were quick to grasp this irony. They declared that freedom or Swaraj was their birthright and fought for political and economic freedom. Urbanization and industrialization. The colonial experience. Industrialization refers to the emergence of machine production based on the use of inanimate power resources like steam or electricity. In most standard Western textbooks of sociology, we learn that in even the most advanced of traditional civilizations, most people were engaged in working on the land. The relatively low level of technological development did not permit more than a small minority to be freed from the curse of agricultural production. By contrast, a prime feature of industrial societies today is that a large majority of the employed population work in factories, offices, or shops rather than agriculture. Over 90% of people in the West live in towns and cities, where most jobs are to be found and new job opportunities are created. Not surprisingly, therefore, we usually associate urbanization with industrialization. They often do occur together, but not always so. For instance, in Britain, the first society to undergo industrialization was also the earliest to move from being rural to a predominantly urban country. In India, the very same British industrialization led to deindustrialization in some sectors and decline of old urban centers, just as manufacturing boomed in Britain. Traditional exports of cotton and silk manufacturers from India declined in the face of Manchester competition. This period also saw further decline of cities such as Surat and Masulipatam, while Bombay and Madras grew. When the British took over Indian states, towns like Thanjavur, Dhaka, and Muridabad lost their courts, and therefore some of the artisans and court gentry. From the end of 19th century, with the installation of mechanized factory industries, some towns became much more heavily populated. Unlike Britain, where the impact of industrialization led to the more people moving into urban areas, in India, the initial impact of the same British industrialization led to people moving into agriculture. The Census of India report shows this clearly. Sociological writings in India have often discussed both the contradictory and unintended consequences of colonialism. Comparisons have been made between industrialization in the West and growth of a Western middle class with that of Indian experience. The box below carries such one observation. It also shows how industrialization is not just about new machine based production but also a story of growth of new social groups in society and new social relationships. In other words, it is about changes in the Indian social culture and structure. Cities had a key role in economic system of empires. Coastal cities such as Mumbai, Kolkata and Chennai were favored. From here, primary commodities could be easily exported and manufactured goods could be cheaply imported. Colonial cities were the prime link between the economic center or core in Britain and periphery or margins in colonized India. Cities in this sense were the concrete expression of global capitalism. In British India, for example, Bombay was planned and redeveloped so that 1900 over three quarters of India's raw cotton was shipped through city. Calcutta exported jute to Dundee while Madras sent coffee, sugar, indigo dyes and cotton to Britain. Urbanization in the colonial period saw the decline of some earlier urban centers and the emergence of new colonial cities. Kolkata was one of the first such cities. In 1690, an English merchant named Job Charnock arranged to lease these three villages named Kolkata, Govindapur, and Sutanuti by the river Hooghly in order to set up a trading post. In 1698, Fort William was established by the river for defensive purposes, and a large open area was cleared around the fort for military engagements. The fort and the open area formed the core of the city that emerged rather rapidly. The tea plantations. We have already seen how industrialization and urbanization did not happen in India quite the way it did in Britain. More importantly, this is not because we began industrialization late, but because our early industrialization and urbanization in the modern period were governed by colonial interest. We cannot go into details about different industry here. We simply take the case of tea industry in India as an example. Official reports show how the colonial government often used unfair means to hire and forcibly keep laborers and clearly acted on behalf of the British planters. From fictional and what other accounts we get a glimpse of what life of planters in this industry. Significantly, the colonial administrators were clear that harsh measures were taken against the laborers to make sure they benefited the planters. They were also fully aware that the laws of a colonialized country did not have to stick to democratic norms that the British back home had to follow in Britain. Industrialization in independent India. We saw in the earlier section how the colonial state had an important role in the way industrialization and urbanization took place in India. Here we very briefly touch upon how the independent Indian state played an active role in promoting industrialization and in some sense were responding to the impact that colonialism had on growth of industry in India. Chapter 5 will deal with in an Indian industrialization and its shift from the early years of independence to development after 1990 with liberalization. For Indian nationalists, the issue of economic exploitation under colonial rule was a central issue. Images of pre-colonial fabled riches of India contrasted with the poverty of British India. The Swadeshi movement strengthened the loyalty of national economy. Modern India's made people realize that poverty was preventable. Indian nationalists saw rapid industrialization of the economy as the path towards both growth and social equity. Development of heavy and machine making industries, expansion of the public sector, and holding of a large cooperative sector were considered very important. A modern and prosperous India, as visualized by Jawaharlal Nehru, was to be built on the edifice of giant steel plants or gigantic dams and power stations. Read Nehru remark on the Bhakra Nangal Dam. Urbanization in independent India. You would more than be aware of increasing urbanization in India. Recent years of globalization have led to enormous expansion and change of cities. In 21st century, India will be witnessing fast pace of urbanization with the ambitious scheme of smart city initiated by Government of India. We shall be dealing with that later in chapter 6. Here we draw from a sociological account of the different kinds of urbanization in India. Writing on different kinds of urbanization witnesses in the first 2 decades after independence, sociologist M.S.A. Rao argued that India and many villages all over India are becoming increasingly subject to the impact of urban influences. But the nature of urban impact varies according to the kind of relations a village has with the city or town. He describes 3 different situations of urban impact as mentioned in the box. The above chart indicates that the urban population and number of UA/towns in India are increasing. The chart below indicates that the percent share of urban population is increasing, but decennial growth rate of urban population shows a decreasing trend. In 1951, 17.29% of India's population, 62.44 million people, were living in 2,843 towns. In 2011, 31.16% of India's population, that is 377.1 million people, were living in 7,935 towns. This shows a steady increase in terms of absolute numbers of UA or towns, and the percent share of urban population. However, the decennial growth of urban population showed a declining trend. During 1981 to 2001 reversed the trend and showed marginal increase in 2011. The decennial growth of the rate of urban population in 1951 was 41.42% and in 2011 it was 31.8%. For the worst times in independence, the absolute increase in population is more in urban areas than in rural areas. This is due to sharp decline in the most growth rate in rural areas, while the growth rate in urban areas remains almost the same. Conclusion: it will be obvious to you that colonialism is not just a topic in history but something which lives on in complex ways in our lives even today. It is also evident that from the above account that industrialization and urbanization imply changes not just in production systems, technological innovations, density of settlements, but also a way of life. You shall be reading more about industrialization and urbanization in independent India in chapter 6 and 5.